Matthew 24 was not fulfilled in 70 AD. Alrighty, Daniel says why Christians don't believe Jesus came back in the first century like he said he would in Matthew 24. He did not say he would come back in the first century. So I was asked this question during the Q&A as to why don't most Christians, or why don't some Christians believe that Jesus came back in the first century, meaning 70 AD. The question is going to be, if you're going to think that Jesus came back in 70 AD, which is fine, it's possible. The question is, how did he come back? Remember, we've got a cult out there. We've got a group of people out there, the Jehovah's Witnesses, who believe that Jesus came back in 1914. Why? Because the prophecy wasn't fulfilled, or at least the way that we thought it would, or they thought it would. And they said that he came back not physically, but spiritually. Okay, well, what does that mean? Did something happen in heaven? Something spiritually different happen in 70 AD? That's the issue. Now, without getting too much into it, I want to cover why you should not believe. I don't think that you should believe that the events of Matthew 24 were fulfilled in 70 AD. So let's go to Matthew 24 and let's start in verse 1. Jesus came out. Now he's speaking not to all of his disciples. He's only speaking to 4 disciples, which I think is important to understand. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up and pointed out to the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." And so he's speaking of the temple, and that it will be torn down. When? Well, that's the issue. And so verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So they're really asking 2 questions. When will these things that are happening that he spoke of, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead you." Well, the issue is going to be this. What we need to think about is when the Lord gives a prophecy, when there's a prophecy given, how do we take the prophecy? Is there any reason to say or to take what he's saying as not what he said? In other words, how do we know if what he said is not what he meant? Does he mean something different? Is there some sort of spiritual understanding that we need to imply here? Or should we take what he's saying at face value? Now, previous to this, every other prophecy that was given that at this point in time that had been fulfilled was fulfilled perfectly, was fulfilled literally. Even if we think about some of the awesome prophecies that God has given, some that are pretty fantastic that you just would not, especially at that time, you wouldn't think, because they're given great detail, it'd be hard to imagine them happening, and then they happen. Such as prophecies relating to Alexander the Great and Greeks' rise, and then even his nation being cut up into 4 pieces, and that none of his posterity, no descendants of his, would inherit it. And then how there's an alliance between a king of the north and the king of the south, that it happens exactly like it's told to happen. Or if we were to go forward, how about the prophecies relating to the nation of Israel? How the nation will in one day, according to, I put it on the screen, Isaiah 66, how in one day Israel becomes a nation, just in one day, reconstituted as a nation. We've never seen anything like that. And the reason why we can bank on what God says is going to be true is because he's God. He will move and cause his word to come true. And so the reason why that's important is because when we hear the words of the Lord, we need to take him at face value for what he says, and not try to look for some hidden meaning or some sort of spiritual meaning. Though these things are given by the Holy Spirit, God means for us to understand and to know and to be able to discern what his words are, that they've come true. And so going back to Matthew 24, he says, "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end." And so the question is, if Matthew 24 was fulfilled in 70 AD, we need to start looking at all the different things that are being spoken of by Jesus to see, did those things come to be? For example, were there wars and rumors of wars? Well, probably rumors of war, but we can't think of any particular wars of note. Not to say that it weren't, but again, everything has to be fulfilled and it has to be known. For nation will rise against nation. Was that happening in 70 AD? Well, certainly Israel was being encroached upon, but then again, Israel was already under subjugation at that point in time. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Were the Jews at that time hated by all nations or just hated by Rome? Well, I think that's debatable. Probably not. This was not a significant nation at the time. But then again, someone might say, well, they've always been hated. Fine. Continuing though, at that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Did we see some sort of great falling away from the church at that time? No, we did not. As a matter of fact, we saw an increase in the number of people coming to the church even during that time. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Here's a question. Another part of this prophecy. Did this happen? Was the gospel of the kingdom preached to the whole world as a testimony, and then the end will come? Was it preached to all nations? Verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolations, which was spoken through Daniel, the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Question, did this happen, this abomination of desolations? Well, let's find out what he's speaking of so that we can kind of compare notes and see is what Jesus is saying in Matthew 24. Did it take place? Well, where do we find that? How about in Matthew chapter 9? Now, this is after he says that these 70 weeks will be decreed. And then after the 69th week, then Messiah will be cut off. Well, that part happened. But then verse 27 of chapter 9 of Daniel, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. That is this lawless man. And he says he will make this covenant for 1 week. Well, remember, there's 1 week left. There's one set of 7 years left. The 70th week, or the 70th year, or the 70th sevens, I should say, in that time. So these last sevens, in that time, there will be a covenant with Israel made with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, that is 3.5 years, in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offerings. And on the wing of abomination and desolation will come one who makes desolate, even until the complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Question, was there a 7-year period of time of note during or around the time of 70 AD? Maybe 63 AD up to 70 AD, 64 AD, somewhere in that area. There's nothing to indicate that. Was there a covenant that was made and then broken halfway through? No, we cannot think of that. As a matter of fact, to get further information, let's go to Daniel chapter 12. And let's look in verse 1. Now, at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress, such as never occurred. The question is, where do we see this at? Well, when we get to verse 21 in Matthew, we're going to see this same word, the same imagery being spoken of, a time of distress or a time of tribulation, such has never been seen before or ever will be seen. Since there was a nation until that time, and at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Did that happen? Remember, this is all part of this abomination of desolation. Did that happen? Now, how do we know this is part of the abomination of desolation? Let's drop down just a little bit in Daniel chapter 12 and go down to verse, to verse 7, and notice what he says. Let's start in verse 7. I heard the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven, and he swore by him who lives, that is the Lord, forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy place or the holy people, all these events will be completed. So this abomination of desolations, remember, he spoke about it being for 3.5 years, or the middle of the 7 years. That's 3.5 years. And so what is time, times, and half a time? That, ladies and gentlemen, is 3.5 years. And then let's drop down a little bit further down to verse 11. from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished, did that happen in 70 AD? And the abomination of desolation, which is what Jesus is bringing up, is set up. There will be 1,290 days. Here's the question. How long is 1,290 days? 3.5 years. Time, times, and half a times. And so we have 3.5 years being spoken of. So this is speaking of the abomination of desolation. Let's go back to Matthew 24. The reason why we're bringing this out is because this has to take place according to Jesus. Verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolations, which was spoken of through Daniel, the prophet standing in the holy place, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Did this occur? Did this take place? Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, what we spoke about in Daniel, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Did these things take place? Were the days cut short? No, the days were not cut short. That was not the end of time. This is what he's speaking of in verse 22. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Let's continue reading. Notice what he says. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out, or behold, he is in the inner room, do not believe them. Verse 27. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, for original God to ask a question, why don't we believe that Jesus came? Again, Jesus needed to have come in Matthew 24, according to this, in 70 AD, to think that that was the fulfillment of the prophecy. Did Jesus come? Well, no, he did not. If he did, how so? Was that the coming that he was speaking of? Remember, all of these details also have to take place. If we're going to say this is the prophecy, and the prophecy was fulfilled, completed, perfected in 70 AD, well, then all of these things will have to have happened. Verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. Did that happen? Well, maybe he's speaking figuratively. Do we think so? And the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall. Are you saying that's figuratively? Because if that's the case, then how do we judge that? How do we know that? I think he means literally, because I think he's talking about the very end of this particular world, and things will be changed. That the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. How so? If this is figuratively. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man on the clouds of sky with power and great glory. Did those things happen? We're going to come back to that. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to another. Did any of that happen? Now, learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branches has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, and now this is a problem for some people. Truly I say to you that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So the question is, when he says this generation, is he speaking in terms of time? Well, the word for this generation does not always convey. Matter of fact, this doesn't necessarily even reference time. It can be used, but it's referencing something specific. It's what's called a demonstrative pronoun. It's speaking of something. So when this particular generation, well, could he be speaking of that generation that lived at that time? Well, the question is which generation? But is he saying for this period of time, the people will not pass away? It could mean that, but it can also be referring to a specific set of occurrences that the people in that generation, when they see those things, they won't pass away. So he could be referring to a particular generation at a time, or a specific generation where we don't know when these things are going to occur. One of these two are possible. The reason why I could not be referring to that generation during the time of 33 AD or 30 AD, then we know that can't be the case because all of those things did not happen. Notice what he says. This generation will not pass away until all Panta, all these things take place. So the question is, did all of those things take place? Well, what are the things that have to take place? Put on the screen. They will say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Question, did any of those things happen? No, they did not. Secondly, was there nations rising against nation? That's debatable. I don't think so, but that's debatable. Famines and earthquakes. Maybe, maybe not. Then they will deliver you, who's the you that they're talking about, to tribulation and kill you. He's only speaking, at this time, he's only speaking to 4 disciples, but he's speaking to just those 4 disciples or all of the rest of them. That can't be the case because John was not killed at that time. Then he says there will be a great falling away from the faith, not having faith. That did not happen in 70 AD. It simply did not. Number 6. This gospel will be preached to the whole world. Was this gospel of Christ, was it preached to the whole world? Well, no, you can't come away and say that that happened either. It absolutely did not happen. Also, number 7, a great tribulation like never seen or will be seen. Well, did that happen? No. Now, was it a great tribulation? Was it a problem? Was it distress at that time? Sure. Has there been worse before or after? I would say that there was probably a greater tribulation amongst or for Israel prior to 70 AD and then even after. After, we're thinking about the Holocaust, which also brings into mind what he says in Ezekiel 37 and again in Isaiah 66, that he is going to reconstitute and bring Israel back into the land as a nation, bringing people from all over back into the land, which happened in 1948. And I think what led up to that was a greater tribulation that they received versus 70 AD, which is the Holocaust. 6 million Jews killed during that. Or how about prior to that? Was there a greater tribulation for Israel when they were kicked out of land and put into captivity? That probably was a greater tribulation. More lives were lost prior to 70 AD and after 70 AD. And so that also needs to be fulfilled as well. Number 8, the sun darkened, moon won't give light, stars fall from the sky. Did that happen? Someone may say, well, it metaphorically happened. It was figurative speech. Well, it's hard to measure God's figurative language. God typically tells us what he's going to do, and we'll know it when it happens. Number 9, don't forget the Son of Man is to return. You do not let people tell you that the Son of Man returned figuratively in power. Well, he left with power. All authority is given to me, Matthew 28. And so he had all authority. So there was nothing new that was going to be given. The Bible tells us in Acts 2 that this Son of Man, he leaves this way. But when he comes back, Acts 1, the same man, the same Jesus who you see leaving, he will come back the exact same way. And we're told that we will see this happen. And then 11, he will gather his people, his elect. Did that happen? No. There are too many things that he said would happen that did not happen. And so you could not take this prophecy as having been fulfilled. Now, the first part of what Jesus said was going to happen about these stones being torn down, this temple being torn down, that did happen. But that was not the second portion of the question or the answer that he was given. Remember, we have to take him at his word. Why? Because God is a God of his word. He's not like us. He's not a man that he should lie. And the reason why this is important doesn't really have a whole lot to do if you're not all that concerned with Israel. It's not that someone is trying to promote Israel, but don't be caught also being someone that is just against Israel for the sake of just being against Israel. You have an issue and ought against Jews. No, that is sinful as well. We're not promoting Israel above anyone else. We're just simply pointing out the promises that God has with Israel. Doesn't mean that God didn't have promises with us and for us who are not Israel. But the point about the promises with Israel is that if he will break his promises with Israel, he'll break his promises with us. Remember, Jesus gave us a promise. He says in John 14, let not your hearts be troubled. Now, he's speaking to his disciples, but this can apply to us as well. He says, believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. if it were not, or dwelling places. If it were not so, I would not have told you so. For I go to prepare a place for you. If I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. If he can make this promise, and then the promise is changed somehow, then that gives us no comfort. Well, we can simply look to Israel the same way. He has made a covenant with Israel, and I want you to notice what he says with Israel. Let's drop down Jeremiah 31, and let's go to verse 35. He says, "Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name." If this fixed order, what fixed order? Well, the sea with its waves, the moon that gives off light, the stars and so forth, the sun. Do we still have those? So as long as those are going to be there, and they will be there until he does away with what he's going to do with this planet, then he says, then the offspring of Israel also will cease from being a nation before me forever. In other words, if they go away, then so too will Israel. They will not. And so therefore we know that Israel will never cease to be a nation for or from before the Lord. They will be a nation. He is going to, the promises that he made with Israel, he is going to fulfill. No one made him make those promises. Just like, again, I think one of the more fantastic prophecies that is visual, that is vivid, that a lot of people who are even alive today can testify. They recall when Israel became a nation, and he prophesied. He said that would happen. He makes this statement before they're taken back out of the land, and that they'll come back into the land. And he says this will happen in one day. There is no way that that was fulfilled any other time in the Bible. And so I think that's important to know, that when he says something, it will be fulfilled. How will his prophecies, how will his word be fulfilled? Exactly like he says, that there is no need to squint, tilt our heads, or try to make an excuse for why it didn't happen that way. Think about the people who are thinking that there is no more Israel. And so let's help God out by saying maybe the church is Israel. The church is the new Israel. The Christians were the new Jews. Well, then here comes 1948, and now we see Israel. Where is he coming back? To the land of Israel. Why is that important? Again, his promises matter. This is a God who says, I will not alter my words. He is not going to alter his words. He didn't have to fix his words up. That is a source of comfort because of all of the many promises that he's made, not for Israel, but for us. And if he is going to change the promises that he's made for Israel to fit, then what's our hope for thinking that he won't do the exact same thing for us? He is a God who keeps his word, and we're not affected if he blesses someone else. We are not so small, so insecure to think that someone else is spoken of, and because he doesn't speak about me as much as he speaks about them, then I'm left out. No, he remembers all of the ones, every last one that the Father personally gave to the Son. Jesus makes a statement that all of us, Jew or Gentile, who are part of the church, because the goal is to be part of the church, all of us who he personally gave to the Son, like a father gives a bride to the groom, all of us that he cares about, loves about, that he's made promises to, his greatest promise was that he will not lose any of us. And so the whole point, the purpose of his promises is for us to be comforted. And to think that Jesus came back in 70 AD or Matthew 24 was fulfilled, that actually impugns God's words and God's promises. That is not the case. We can rest assured that what God says, he means, and what he means, he says. He didn't have to fix things up. Why? Because he's God. If he tells you that he'll pick any, that he can strike the head of a pin, then guess what? He can strike the head of a pin. If he can tell you what he is going to do to the T, to the time, to the moment, such as the birth of Christ and the death and manner of his death, well, then that tells us we can take comfort in everything else that he says. So no, the prophecies of Matthew 24 were not fulfilled in 70 AD. Jesus did not come back in 70 AD in the first century. He's going to come back, and I can promise you, when he does, everyone will know it. Amen.